Okay, welcome back everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce the second speaker of today, Stefanie Dach from the University of West Bohemia. She works and has been working recently on Sellar's practical philosophy. She has published some recent papers on the topic, including Sellar's practical reality and practical truth in theoria, and Sellar's with intentions and odd statements in synthesis. And she also reviewed the recent compilation that Kyle Ferguson and Jeremy Kuntz published, The Metaphysics of Practice. So without further ado, let's welcome Stefanie with morality as team reasoning.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to Jeremy and Ronald for organizing this wonderful thing. I'm going to continue this theme of connecting Sellars to the team reasoning approach from game theory. The aim of my talk is to explore from a Sellarsian perspective, because that's where I come from. So to explore from a Sellarsian perspective how these two approaches, the potentialities and potential problems of an interchange between these two approaches. So in the first two sections of the talk, I'd like to point out some points of contact between the team reasoning approach to coordination cooperation from game theory and Sellars' approach in moral philosophy. And as we'll see, there is quite a number of these points of contact. But that then generates the question whether we couldn't use the core idea of a reasoning process from a we perspective around which both of these approaches are built in order to somehow capture both of the phenomena with which these approaches are concerned, so cooperation and coordination on the one hand and morality on the other hand. And especially I'd like to discuss this under the heading of the question whether we could somehow extend the team reasoning approach to also give an account of moral concepts like moral obligation or the moral art and of moral reasoning. And now the third and the fourth part of the talk will be dedicated to discussing precisely this question. In the third part, I'd like to raise a very specific problem about this. And in the fourth part, I'd like to discuss some solutions with an inclination towards a certain solution inspired by a quite specific reading of Sellars' own approach in moral philosophy. Okay, so Natalie already introduced team reasoning, so I think I can make this quick. As Natalie already said, there are a number of different theories under this heading of team reasoning. I will focus only on Bacharach's approach here, not on Robert Sugden's approach, for the sake of simplicity. And as Natalie already said, the motivation to introduce something like team reasoning into game theory is that classical game theory cannot give a good account of how human agents actually behave, actually decide in certain decision situations where coordination and cooperation is concerned. Natalie already worked with the example of the prisoner's dilemma, where classical game theory, with its focus on individual rationality, can only recommend mutual defection as a rational solution to this game. However, of course, on the one hand, we see that players gain a suboptimal payoff when they mutually defect. They can do much better if they mutually cooperate. And also, if we confront actual human agents with such prisoners' dilemmata, we find quite substantial cooperation rates, even if the prisoner's dilemma is played only once. So depending a bit on the features of the prisoner's dilemma you use, you find cooperation rates from about 20% up to 60%. So many people decide to cooperate in prisoners' dilemmata. And classical game theory cannot reconstruct this choice, it cannot explain it, and it cannot mark it as rational. So there's something like an explanatory and a normative gap in classical game theory. And advocates of team reasoning recommend that in order to fill this gap, we need to extend classical game theory by allowing, besides this perspective of individual rationality, where the reasoner asks, what should I do in order to maximize my payoff, by allowing, besides this I perspective, also a team perspective or we perspective, where the reasoner asks, what should we do in order to maximize our payoff, what we gain from that decision situation. Now, the rough process, and Natalie also talked a bit about that, looks like this for Bacharach. We now have at least two practical perspectives that we can take up on a decision situation, an I perspective and a team perspective. So the first step needs to be some kind of choice or switch into one of these perspectives. For Bacharach, this switch into a team perspective is effected by what he calls processes of group identification, which are purely psychological processes. As Natalie said, this switch into the team perspective for Bacharach is something that more or less happens to you, right? You don't do it for a reason, according to Bacharach. In any case, the switch into a team perspective on the decision problem leads to what Bacharach calls a transformation in agency. So the agent will understand herself differently as an agent after switching into this perspective. She will understand herself as a member of the team, as a member of us, and reason from this perspective. And this probably sounds quite familiar to Sellarsians, right? After this switch into the team perspective, the agent will then not ask, what's the best decision for me to take in order to maximize my payoff, but she will ask, what is the best combination of our decisions for the team or for us? Of course, there might be different criteria for identifying what the best combination of decisions is. Bacharach suggests a utilitarian criterion. So the best combination of decisions is that which secures the highest sum of individual payoffs. And that would, for example, be mutual cooperation in our prisoner's dilemma. After having identified this best combination of decision, the agent then reasons towards her own component in that combination of decisions. It's very important for Bacharach to be able to say that this is a reasoning process, so the outcomes of this process, they are something that we choose or do for a reason. That means that a cooperative choice in the prisoner's dilemma is a rational choice, at least from this team perspective. This reasoning step itself is reconstructed in a number of different ways by Bacharach and his editors, Natalie and Robert Sugden. What we have here is what they call a basic team reasoning schema. It's in the plural form here. Natalie had it in the singular, but I think the difference doesn't matter so much for us. So according to this basic team reasoning schema, the team reasoner is reconstructed as reasoning. We are the members of the team. Each of us identifies with the team. Each of us wants the value of our joint utility to be maximized, and complex action A uniquely maximizes this joint utility. Therefore, each of us should choose her component of A. Now, a few remarks about that. According to at least some advocates of team reasoning, for example, Natalie, the conclusion of this piece of team reasoning is what we could call a collective intention. And these would seem to be rather close to Sellars' concept of a community intention, which is why I've rendered this conclusion already as a Sellars-style community intention in parentheses. Now, what advocates of team reasoning also suggest, at least at times, is that the conclusion states what the agent should do or ought to do. So it's in a way also a normative statement about the agent's action. That is, we have a tendency here, maybe implicit, to assimilate collective intentions and normative statements, ought statements, which is something that we will find again in Sellars in a minute. And it is something which, towards the end of the talk, I'd like to suggest that maybe there's a more helpful view of ought statements, but for the time being, I'll just take the idea for granted. Now, one more remark about that. The team reasoning framework has been developed to account for prototypical coordination and cooperation decision situations. So that means for situations, for example, like deciding within the local football team about how we ought to fight the next match in order to win. That is situations where we have warrant in assuming that the premises of this piece of team reasoning are true, right? You can assume that your co-team members really identify with the team. When we want to apply this to the case of moral reasoning, this will not be so straightforward, right? When we reason about what we morally ought to do, confronted with a certain decision situation, we typically don't have warrant in assuming that every relevant agent really identifies with the team or with the moral community, that is, takes up a moral perspective on that decision situation, him or herself. So premises like 2 and 3, they will turn out to be not that straightforward, problematic, if we want to apply this to the case of moral reasoning. Okay, but before I get to that, I'd like to talk a bit about Sellars and point out some similarities to the team reasoning approach. I'll try to make that brief, since Natalie has pointed out some things, and I think Heath and Jeremy will also talk about these points of contact. Now, Wilfrid Sellars' moral philosophy, one of the central questions of his moral philosophy is how we should understand ought statements, like, I ought to do A. Of course, there are other oughts besides the moral ought. There's an ought of prudence, or oughts expressing obligations towards more restricted groups, as Bill has pointed out. But I'd like just to leave these other oughts to the side for the moment, just focus on the moral case. Now, there's somewhat of a debate within Sellars scholarship about how Sellars in the end wanted to understand ought statements. What is not in dispute, however, is that he wanted to account for ought statements somehow in terms of what he calls community intentions, or sometimes called we intentions. Some prototypical formulations of these we intentions, community intentions, include we shall do A, I shall subscript we do A, each of us shall do A, or shall be each of us do A. This is a more regulated form. What is important about these community intentions and what distinguishes them from individual intentions or personal intentions is that they are objectively evaluable. That means that there is, at least in principle, a procedure which allows me to pick out those community intentions which everybody ought to have. And they are what Sellars then calls categorically reasonable community intentions. And he thinks that he needs these objective features of community intentions to account for the objective features of moral discourse, for example, for the fact that moral statements can be true or false. Okay, and now for some points of contact with the team reasoning approach. Much like advocates of team reasoning, and Natalie talked about this quite a lot, so I try to make that brief. Also, Sellars thinks that when we are confronted with a decision problem, we can take up one of at least two incommensurable practical points of view. It's at least two because for every group I identify with, there might be one more, right? But I'll just focus on the moral case. Switching between these two points of view, also for Sellars, seems to involve something like an agency transformation. So he says when we intend from a community point of view, we intend as the member of a community, as a member of us. Now these two practical points of view, that is the personal point of view and the community or moral point of view, so the I perspective and the we perspective in team reasoning, they are incommensurable. As Natalie said, sometimes what it is rational to do from one of these points of view will not be rational from the other. They are incommensurable, but they are still similarly structured. So both of them are anchored in an overarching intention or end. I shall live a satisfying life, all things considered, for the personal point of view, and we shall maximize our common welfare for the community or moral point of view. And then I can use practical reasoning, means-ends reasoning, to derive further intentions from these overarching intentions. So both of them are structured hierarchically, you could say, and both of them are characterized by instrumental rationality, which is something which we heard, right? Something that Bacharach, for example, also emphasizes. Now, a piece of reasoning from this we point of view, the community point of view, might look like this in Sellars. This is a bit simplified. Of course, Sellars introduces a lot of constraints, but I think it's just okay for our purposes here. So the reasoner, or the agent, reasoning from this community perspective or moral perspective, reasons, we shall maximize our common welfare. The intention, we shall maximize our common welfare, implies we shall do A, therefore we shall do A. And then she can reason towards her component in that collective action. Therefore, I shall subscript we do A or do my component in A, depending on what kind of action A is. Now, if this piece of practical reasoning is valid, then the conclusions will count as categorically reasonable. So it's the community intentions that everybody ought to have. This is this objective procedure I was talking about. And at least according to a standard understanding of Sellars' account of odd statements, these community intentions are expressed in odd statements. So again, here we have this idea of closely assimilating moral judgment and a specific type of intention, which I will take for granted for now. Maybe some further points of detail. Both of these accounts have a kind of utilitarian leaning. So also Sellars says that his account in moral philosophy is utilitarian in content. And we might read, we shall maximize our common welfare in utilitarian terms, if we want. And also, and this is like what Kyle raised in the discussion before, it seems that for Sellars as well, this... or which practical point of view I take up, the personal one or the community or the moral one, that this is not something that I do for a reason. Yeah? And this is, I think, the passage that Kyle was referring to. Sellars says at one point, which choice one makes is a revelation of what one at that moment is. So whether a reason from the personal point of view or the moral point of view, the community point of view, this is not something I do for a reason, but more like a revelation of my character. Okay, so we see all these kinds of similarities in how these two approaches conceive of a certain reasoning process from a collective perspective. The analog to team reasoning in Sellars is reasoning from this community point of view, reasoning with community intentions. So we have these similarities in how the two approaches understand this process. However, it's quite important to point out that they differ in their motivations and targets. So Sellars' approach is a classical conceptual analysis of concepts like the moral odd, obligation, the moral point of view, while team reasoning is an empirically inspired approach. So the motivation is to be able to explain empirical phenomena, that is how human agents do decide and behave in certain situations. Also, Sellars, obviously he focuses on morality, and he does not focus on more basic phenomena of joint action like coordination and cooperation. But this is precisely the target of team reasoning. And team reasoning, at least as far as I understand it, is not designed, at least by most of the theories, to account for moral reasoning or to be able to capture moral concepts like ought. But now, since we see all of the similarities in how Sellars, in his moral philosophy and team reasoning, how they envisage this reasoning process from a collective perspective, we of course might want to ask whether a theory built around the idea of such a collective reasoning process, whether it couldn't somehow satisfy both of these motivations. That is, account for cooperation and coordination on the one hand, and also somehow account for moral concepts or moral reasoning. And I'd like to ask specifically whether we couldn't understand team reasoning as an approach which can somehow also capture moral reasoning and moral concepts like the moral art. I think that if we can answer these questions in the affirmative, that might have all kinds of interesting implications. Like the picture which then emerges is one where coordination and cooperation are somehow the basic processes, so the processes that I can already explain, or advocates of team reasoning can already explain using this team reasoning approach, and that morality is then either one of these processes or, and that's probably better, is a process which builds on these more basic processes of coordination and cooperation. Since game theory and team reasoning, specifically also since they want to make a contribution to explaining how cooperation could have emerged in human evolution, this explanatory contribution might then perhaps, of course, be extendable also to the moral case. And this is where, like the outlines of a theory emerging here would, for example, make contact with a quite influential and more empirically minded program asking the same question: how could human morality have emerged? And that is the one by Michael Tomasello, who just takes the same explanatory direction as relevant, that we start out with cooperation in prototypical situations, small-scale, dyadic situations, and then start building morality from there by scaling up. Okay, but what I would like to discuss is like the problems for this idea, and specifically I'd like to focus on a certain problem. I think like there's probably a host of problems connected to this idea, starting from utilitarianism and questions like whether we can use game-theoretic approaches to scale up to something like an encompassing moral community of all rational beings. But I'd like to focus on a specific problem about, like on a certain trait of the moral art and moral reasoning, which is reflected in Sellars' concept of a community intention, so which Sellars seems to be sensitive to. So it seems to be at least not implausible to say that we can engage in moral reasoning even in situations where we know that not all the relevant actors will also take up a moral point of view on the decision problem, and maybe even in situations where we know that nobody else takes up this moral point of view. So, for example, if I behave in a morally wrong way, then it certainly does not count as an excuse to say that other agents did not take up a moral perspective either. In Sellars, this trait of moral reasoning is reflected in a certain somewhat controversial feature of his community intentions. So he says an individual can have an intention of intersubjective form. This is a community intention, even if no one else in point of fact shares it. So we can community intend alone. Community intentions are not necessarily shared. This is somewhat controversial, but it seems to be at least motivated if we think of Sellars' concept of a community intention as something which is meant to account for moral odd statements in the end, and if we accept that moral reasoning has this trait that I pointed out. This situation where I reason about what I morally ought to do, but know that other agents, or at least some other agents, will not take up a moral perspective. This would seem to be the typical case when engaging in moral reasoning, right? I think we are quite warranted in assuming that that it's quite probable that there will be free riders and so forth. And it's precisely this case, or this situation where the following two odd statements would seem to be applicable, appropriate, where they would seem to have a point. You won't do A, but you ought to do A. And you won't do your part in A, but still we ought to do A. So again, I think that at least initially, at first sight, these odd statements don't seem to be implausible, they don't seem to be contradictory, and they seem to have a point in the kind of situation I described, precisely to remind someone, to remind a free rider, for example, of his moral obligations. Now, this idea, again, seems to be reflected in a feature of Sellars's community intentions, which is maybe even less counterintuitive than the first one, and this is that Sellars seems to allow community intentions like, each of us shall do A, but you will not do A. So he says, and this is a quote, the following is a perfectly coherent intention, shall be each of us do A, and most of us will not do A. This is perfectly coherent, no problem about that, according to Sellars, which is maybe not an attitude we would like to share, yeah, to this community intention. It seems somewhat counterintuitive that I can intend something while knowing that it's actually impossible to realize. But again, this seems at least to some extent motivated if we think about the demands, the pressures, the requirements facing Sellars's concept of a community intention. Because if we take odd statements like 1 and 2 to be something that we need to account for, and if we take odd statements to be expressions of community intentions, then it seems that we have a reason, at least, for allowing community intentions of this sort. So Sellars seems to be sensitive to these features of moral reasoning and the moral odd. However, as I would like to argue, within a team reasoning approach, at least as it stands, it's hard to account for these features. So I return to a prisoner's dilemma. So this is like returning from the all-encompassing moral community to a dyadic interaction. But I think if we find problems in this simple dyadic case with accounting for concepts like odd, then this will probably just scale up to the moral level. Now, prisoner's dilemmata can be used, of course, to model also many types of morally relevant situations. So we can give our prisoner's dilemma here a background story which has a moral flavor, at least. So we can imagine this prisoner's dilemma to model a case where we jointly use a renewable but exhaustible resource, for example, such as Gerhard Hardin's commons. And cooperation would then mean a sustainable, responsible use of the resource, and defection would mean exploiting the resource with higher short-term gains, however, for the individual player. And now imagine that we are player 1, and we know, for whatever reasons, that player 2 will not take up a team perspective, so moral perspective, on this decision problem. So we know that player 2 will take up a perspective of individual rationality, and since player 2 is rational, this means that she will choose defect. So this would be modeling this typical case in which, or this typical situation in which we find ourselves when engaging in moral reasoning. We know that others will not take up the moral perspective. Okay, and in this situation, there are some odd statements that might be plausible. So, for example, I could formulate the odd statement, I, player 1, ought to choose defect. This is not a moral odd, this is an odd of prudence, something recommended from a perspective of individual rationality. So something that I can generate using classical game theory. There also might be the odd statement available, I, player 1, ought to choose cooperate. This is something, again, that Bacharach's, at least Bacharach's approach to team reasoning allows me to reason to generate. So this is fine. Yeah? So these two odd statements are ones that I can somehow cope with within a team reasoning approach. However, odd statements like 3 and 4 are more problematic. But they seem to have a point. They don't seem to be implausible. These are precisely instances of the odd statements we had on the slide before. So player 2 ought to choose cooperate even though she doesn't. And each of us ought to choose cooperate, even though player 2 does not choose cooperate, but she counts as one of us. This fourth odd statement, that corresponds precisely to this counterintuitive Sellarsian community intention. Each of us shall choose cooperate, but player 2 won't choose cooperate. Now, and it seems that 3 and 4 have a point, but that I cannot reason to these odd statements. I cannot generate them using a team reasoning approach. In order to show that, here are two team reasoning schemata. So on the left-hand side, we have this basic one, which we already encountered at the beginning. And in the situation we are now considering, the prisoner's dilemma, and we know that player 2 will not take up a team perspective, it's obvious that premises 2 and 3 are false. It's precisely not true that each of us identifies with the team. Player 2 doesn't. So I can't use this team reasoning schema to generate a conclusion like each of us should choose her component of A. What is more applicable in our case is what Bacharach calls restricted team reasoning. This is a type of team reasoning which is used precisely in situations, in our situation, where we know that some members of our group won't identify with the group, so won't take up this group or team perspective, in our case, player 2. But this team reasoning schema, it only allows me to talk about each member of T, where T is the subgroup of the whole group, which consists of members which identify with the group. So in our case, it consists of player 1, of me, but it does not include player 2, right? Player 2 is not part of this subgroup which does identify with the group. So this restricted team reasoning allows me to formulate odd statements maybe about what I should do, or what I ought to do, or what other group members who identify with the group ought to do, but it does not allow me to formulate odd statements about what player 2, in our case, ought to do. So to make this short, it seems that in the team reasoning framework as it stands, we cannot account for 3 and 4. But it would seem a bit radical to say, or this would have to be argued, right, that we can somehow drop 3 and 4, that they are not important, that they are implausible, and so forth. So the problem is that if a player does not team reason, I cannot state anything about her obligations, about what she ought to do, about what she morally ought to do, and I can't state anything about what we jointly morally ought to do. And this would seem to be a gap, right? That's something that we'd like to fill probably in an approach which can account for our moral odds. I skipped this slide. This is just to show that this problem does not depend on features of the prisoner's dilemma, so this disalignment between individual and collective interests. It seems to be more general. It crops up also in situations where individual and collective interests are somewhere aligned. Okay, and so what we would want to do probably is extend this team reasoning approach somehow in order to be able to account for these problematic odd statements. And what I would like to do now is discuss some ideas about how to do that. But before doing that, I'd like to, I think it's good to reflect on some desiderata for such a solution. The extension should be conservative, I think, in the sense that it should be in the spirit of the team reasoning approach, which tries to do as much as possible with game-theoretic instruments, as much as possible based on the idea of rationality, because it would be easy to say, okay, we just assume some psychological mechanisms, reactive attitudes, and this just allows me somehow to maybe generate something like odds or obligations, but this would precisely not be in this spirit of trying to do as much as possible with game-theoretic instruments. And the second desideratum, ideally, we can account for these odds, we can make these odd statements available from within the team reasoner's point of view, so from an inside point of view. Because it would be easy to say, okay, that from an external point of view, maybe the game theorist's point of view, we can just trivially identify in the prisoner's dilemma which strategy profile maximizes joint utility, and this is what the agents ought to choose. However, I think that if we want to exploit, especially if we want to exploit this potential explanatory contribution that team reasoning might make to how such concepts like the moral ought could have emerged, then we can't presuppose this external point of view. We have to start with team reasoners doing the team reasoning, so with an inside point of view. Okay, and now I'd like to look at some solutions. I'll jump the first two because of time, and just look at two other solutions which share the same basic idea. And this basic idea is that we extend this team reasoning approach by adding a counterfactual element to team reasoning. This would seem like a somewhat obvious move to make because it has a lot of precedence in in the history of thinking about morality, like it's strong in the Kantian tradition, for example. And we find like ideas of this sort also in Sellars. So here's a quote from Sellars. Those intentions of the form, we would that anyone did A if in C, so community intentions, are categorically valid, which would be the legislation of an organized community of ideally rational beings, qua motivated by the categorically valid intention to maximize the common good. Okay, but now I think that there are like maybe more workable and less workable ways of cashing in this basic idea of adding a counterfactual element. And I'd like to discuss what I think is maybe more problematic first and then come to a different type of solution. So according to this first solution or suggestion, which is maybe more straightforward, what I or somebody or what we morally ought to do is stated in a conclusion which I arrive at when I reason as if we were a team. So the idea would be that if we take our basic team reasoning schema and we take our situation, which we were considering, the prisoner's dilemma, where we know that player 2 will not take up a team perspective. So we know that premises 2 and 3 are false, but we now say, okay, we counterfactually assume them to be true, and that allows me then to reason towards conclusions like each of us shall choose her component of A, and if this is expressed in an ought statement, each of us ought to choose her component of A. But, of course, we know that player 2 will not choose her component of A. So the idea would be to introduce something like counterfactual team reasoning. Now, I think this is... I think that a lot more would have to be said in order to make this unproblematic, because it's not really clear here when we counterfactually assume premises 2 and 3 to be true, what the status of the conclusion would be if it somehow inherits this counterfactual status. And Sellars is clear, at least, that if we reason from a moral point of view towards an intention, and we really go through the reasoning, then we endorse that conclusion fully. So also in the sense of the conclusion, the intention playing a role in our behavioral economy, triggering our actions. He's also explicit that ought statements are, at least in the moral case, are endorsed unconditionally, not on the assumption that something else is the case. And it's just not clear whether the conclusion can have this strong status if I counterfactually team reason. So it's not clear, as Catherine Elgin says, how a counterfactually assumed premise could illuminate reality or something, in our case, which we take to be objective. There are a number of course, of situations where we use counterfactual reasoning and use that to good effect, but none of these would seem to present a good model for the moral case. Maybe the best one is idealizations in science, but even there, when we use an idealized premise, like gas molecules being perfectly elastic spheres, for example, even there we have an independent way of checking on the truth value of the conclusion by measurement. which would not seem to be available in the moral case. So I think this is not to say that this won't work, it's just to say that more would have to be said. And this is why I'd like to suggest a different approach in cashing out this idea of counterfactuality. And we might start by noting that, at least for Sellars, counterfactual conditionals are veiled metalinguistic statements about implication relations between statements. So to say that this match would have lighted if it had been struck is to say that the statement, this match lights, is implied by the statement, this match is struck. And now the idea would be, maybe we can find an analog to that in the practical domain. And it seems that Sellars gives us precisely the instruments that we need here, since, at least in his more mature writings on odd statements, on community intentions, he seems to draw up this standard account, which I've been taking for granted until now, that odd statements are expressions of community intentions, but seems to introduce a metalinguistic approach to odd, according to which odd statements are not expressions of community intentions, but they are statements about the implication relations between community intentions, so metalinguistic statements. In our case, then, in the case of our prisoner's dilemma, where we know that player 2 will not take up a team perspective, an odd statement like each of us ought to choose cooperate, and this was one of the problematic ones, would then not be the expression of a community intention, but it would be a statement about implication relations. So a statement like the intention, each of us shall choose cooperate, is implied by the intention, this overarching one, we shall maximize our common welfare. So in effect, it wouldn't be the conclusion of such a piece of team reasoning, this odd statement, but it would be a statement about this piece of team reasoning. It would say of this piece of team reasoning, which is kind of a Sellarsian team reasoning crossbreed, it would say that this piece of team reasoning is valid, which we can say, of course, without assuming the truth of the conclusions. So that would be allowed to say that each of us ought to choose cooperate, even though premise 2 is false. So even though player 2 will not choose cooperate. Okay, so this is the idea. This would be like a conservative extension of the team reasoning framework. It would be, these odds should be available then from an inside point of view. And it's a way in which Sellars's approach could enrich the team reasoning framework, or thinking about team reasoning as well. So it would be a kind of cross-fertilization here. This approach, I think, it has much more would have to be said, of course, in defense of that. This is clear. It retains the idea that cooperation and coordination, what we can prototypically understand using team reasoning, is basic, and then moral discourse, moral reasoning, concepts like the moral odd build on that, in the sense now that moral odds, moral concept work on a second-order level about this first-order level discourse, which we can already understand using team reasoning. And I think this promises to be, if it's workable, of course, this promises to be a compact account of coordination and cooperation on the one hand, and moral decision-making and moral concepts on the other, using this combination of team reasoning elements and Sellarsian elements. So this might be something which is worthwhile exploring more. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, we have a bit over 25 minutes for discussion. Kirk?
Thanks very much. Very interesting. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the idea of capturing the internal point of view, because I was thinking, you know, these oughts, the team reasoning ought and the personal ought, look like they need to be relativized to the frame, right? So you could think, I ought not to cooperate, but I ought, sub we, to cooperate, something like that. And since they're different notions of ought, they're not in conflict, right? Now, when you are describing how to respond to the problem for Sellars, you said you wanted to do it from the internal point of view. And you couldn't just accept this sort of, they're different oughts. And if you just track the one ought, you're going to get both of us ought to do it because that's the frame for team reasoning. So that's why I was understanding that. Is that so far so good? Yeah. Okay. But now I'm a little bit worried that in the end maybe you sort of reproduce the external point of view because now the solution in the end is to say that ought statements just are saying something about the relation between statements, right? So it's just saying if you look at the team reasoning schema, it's valid. Okay. But that seems like it's kind of external point of view. It's just, again, saying that it's a different kind of ought, one that captured the validity of this form of reasoning. So I'm wondering whether in part it's what is the internal point of view and have we got out of the external point of view?
Of course, I haven't really said anything, right, about this process of how a team reasoner could develop these oughts from an internal point of view. But I think then that there are accounts in the literature of how you might do that, right? For example, most famously probably Robert Brandam's account of how we come to develop metalinguistic statements about our first-order practices, which make explicit things that we are already implicitly committed to within these first-order practices. So the idea would here be that, of course, you already have something like accepted inferential relations, so you already cooperate, right? This is somehow presupposed. People already cooperate, they already reason in similar ways, they only just don't represent this. Reasoning, they don't represent these relations between the intentions or the different parts of a piece of team reasoning, but we already have something like implicit normative practices, and ought statements would now be one way of making these implicit practices, what we already implicitly accept, explicit. So this would be a way, maybe, it's just probably also depends on how you, on whether you agree with Brandam on that or not. And this might be a way of making these ought statements available from an internal point of view. Does that answer the question?
Well, partly, but if we go back to the idea that the oughts are just relativized different frames, that's also something that someone could potentially who team reasons come to see and then give the answer there. But I thought that wouldn't be appropriate even if the person self-reflectively knew that the oughts were incommensurable.
Yeah, okay, I think at that point in the talk, I already presupposed that we have a statement, a concept of ought. I was just reflecting on what that concept of ought allows us to do, what statements we can formulate with it, having this concept of ought. So I think this wasn't so much about an external or internal point of view. And now maybe your question is that how we can see that these ought statements conflict, and we can see the conflict only from an external point of view. I
don't want to take up too much time, but the problem was to see, how I could legitimate saying that the other person ought to cooperate when I know that the other person is not in the team, right? Mm-hmm. And one solution to that is to say, well, of course, the other person ought sub we to cooperate. But it was never a question whether the person ought to sub I cooperate. We know for each of us, sub I, we shouldn't cooperate. So I have an easy answer to the question just by subscripting the ought. But I thought that was off the table because somehow that wasn't motivational for the other. That was my...
Yeah, that is, I think, certainly connected to something that I haven't discussed, is whether there's normative pressure or that what I say is presupposes a bit at least that there is something like normative pressure to take up this team perspective, and we don't know where that comes from, right? I'm not really sure what to say on that. I thought about it, but maybe at some points, and I think team reasoning does that as well, at some points we will have to presuppose that psychology comes into play. Yeah. Of course, we can also say that for a group, it will be advantages if members take up a team perspective, right? Because that just maximizes group payoff, and in the end, indirectly benefits the individual. So there might be sources of such normative pressure. Maybe, for example, in evolutionary pressures, that would be what, for example, Tomasello would say. At some point, we just found ourselves in a situation where we had to cooperate. And there was this kind of external pressure at that point, either cooperate or go extinct, maybe. Yeah, but for sure, there is this open question, yeah, where does this normative pressure for taking up a community perspective come from? And this is somehow needed in the account.
So this is great, because I think my question is about that issue in particular. So as you know, I really like your metalinguistic reading. I think there's a lot going there. But I wonder if it really overcomes the problem, precisely because you can present a person with, they can know that it's the case that we shall A follows from we shall maximize the community welfare, and they just have no interest in maximizing the community welfare. And so then it is an issue of like, whence the normative force that we ought to maximize the community welfare. And there it seems to me, yeah, reactive attitudes or something like being able to put yourself into the perspective of other people and think about, or even just, you might even do it instrumentally. Like, look, you might play this game again with this person, and in which case you want to establish fair play. So can you really, I mean, this came out at the end of your exchange with Kirk, and you'd said you hadn't given it much thought, but can you really say you've resolved the problem if at the end of the day, the person just might say, look, yeah, I totally get there's an implication about what I, as a member of the group, ought to do as following from maximizing the general welfare. The thing is, I just have no interest in maximizing the general welfare.
I think maybe I wouldn't even say that I resolved the problem, right? This is more like a suggestion to explore. So this will be a bit like overstating what I wanted to do. Like I was concerned with the question, how could we come to formulate these odd statements at all? And this is a bit independent, I think, maybe not completely, but at least to some extent, independent of the question whether others are moved by these odd statements. Cannot be completely independent, because otherwise if these odd statements never would move anybody, then it's no point in having them in our language. But what these odd statements at least do then is point out implication relations to remind someone who does not take up a we perspective of the thing that would be right to do from this we perspective. And then we could always argue, but this is connected then to the problem that Kirk pointed out. If you want to be one of us, then this is just how you ought to behave, right? And then we might need to presuppose some kind of external pressures which make it good for that individual to be one of us. Yeah, there is a point probably where we will need to presuppose something that I just cannot account for anymore in terms of these game-theoretic instruments, in terms of so I concede that.
I like this as a Sellars interpretation, but I worry that it might end up giving us the wrong account of the content of morality. Okay, so sort of thinking about the sort of level that you didn't want to talk about, like the sort of intermediate we groups before you get to the community of all rational beings. Yeah, I suppose one way of sort of extending your story to that is to say sort of stuff about, say, what we ought to do as a bunch of philosophers, the claims about what follows from the collective intentions or collective commitments we have as a group of philosophers. Now, if we're thinking about that, we can easily imagine sort of having an argument and some people saying, well, you know, when we're thinking about what follows, we ought to
assume that everybody's going to be fully compliant. And then you can also imagine somebody saying, no, look, if we really want to think about what follows from this, we have to be realistic, we have to sort of take into account that people are only going to be partially compliant. So, yeah, what really follows from our collective commitment is what we should do in a situation where we know that people are only going to partly comply. So you get an argument about what it is that we ought to do. And you can easily imagine the sort of partial compliance side sort of actually winning that argument. Right? Okay. So if you find that plausible, then sort of it begins to look as though sort of when you now move up to the committee of the community of all rational beings, again, what follows from the collective commitments of the community of all rational beings? Well, it might be what each of us should do if we're all compliant. But it might also be sort of what we should each do if we know that people are going to be partially compliant. And now, my sense is that, that Sellars wants the content of morality to be kind of Kantian. It's about, what we should all do if we're legislators in a kingdom of ends. But it looks as though, on the account that you're offering, and I think that might well be sort of Sellars' account, it looks as though what's going to fall out of the account might end up being a lot less Kantian in terms of the content of morality than Sellars really wants. What do you think?
Okay, maybe I'd like to, I'm not sure really completely addresses your concern, but when we look at these odd statements, I didn't want to say that the odd statements 1 or 2 are somehow implausible or things like that. I think that using the resources that I've outlined, you can have all of these 4. Of course, they are mutually incompatible, at least at first sight. This is because, like Kirk said, we need to relativize them to a certain frame. I think Sellars offers, in other papers, he offers instruments for doing that. So we can say that all of these odd statements are true in the situation, but relativized to different frames. For example, for 1 and 2, this is most clearly visible, relativized to an I frame and to a team reasoning, a we frame. But that means that I could, if this works, that I could formulate both odd statements, like the full-blooded Kantian moral odd statements, where we consider what we would do as members of an ideally rational, an ideal community of rational beings. So it allows us to formulate these, but it also allows us to formulate these more cautious odd statements, which take into account that some of the members of a potential moral community just won't take up the moral perspective, so we don't have an ideal moral community. So I think this is flexible enough to allow us to formulate both of these odd statements. Just they will be true, relativized to a different frame or to a different set of premises that I would start reasoning from, or that I am considering as what implies a certain community intention in the end. But I don't think that the account makes, for example, these more cautious odds unavailable. Does that address the concern that you had?
No, I think my concern was, it's not that it makes these ones more accessible, it's that it makes them too accessible. So the thought is that sort of, I suppose it's going to be parallel to what sort of Sellars says in the case of theoretical reasoning about how, enzymatic reasoning really is reasoning. It doesn't need an extra premise with a sort of material component.
Yeah, that might be a separate question, right? To what extent you need to state to what this can be a material, just material implications. But I think, looking at that from a Sellarsian perspective, I don't think it's too flexible. I don't think that Sellars wanted to account for odd just in the sense of the moral odd. Of course, this is the strongest, maybe, but a specific type of odd. This is clear. But when you look at how he proceeds, for example, in Science and Metaphysics, in the last chapter of that, he has all types of different odds, and he somehow tries to account for them all. He tries to give a theory which can cover many different types of odd. So I don't see the flexibility of this as a downside of the approach. And when you, for example, also look at his paper, and now I'm missing the title, CDI, where he discusses Chisholm's paradox of things that you ought to do, given that you've already violated an obligation that you have. There he says that both, he doesn't say it like in this explicit way, like this is Sellars, right? But he seems to say that both odd statements like, I ought to return this book since I've borrowed it, and odd statements like, I ought not to return this book since I've never borrowed it. Both of these odd statements, I ought to return the book and I ought not to return the book, can be true. It just depends, or they are just relativized to different sets of background information. So he seems himself he wants to be quite flexible about this, about what we can do using this concept of odd and what odd statements we can formulate. And I think this is a good thing, right? Because our actual practice using odd is quite flexible. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just briefly, I think Natalie sort of touched on it. Also, the team reasoning approach applied morality would focus on some function for maximizing group welfare, which was specifically moral in character. And then you have your moral theory and just plug in the right thing, and it might be a Kantian story, and then you'd get the moral ought that the Kantians want. It might be utilitarian and so on. So I think it's flexible enough to accommodate any story about morality.
Yeah, and I have a tendency to agree with that.
Hi, thank you so much. I've benefited so much from your work and been challenged by it, so it's really exciting to see what you're doing here. So thank you. I want to ask you, I wanted to touch on this, the thing that came up in discussion about normative pressure to, whether there's normative pressure to adopt the moral point of view or the team identity. In Science and Metaphysics, it's really hard to tell where Sellars' thinking ends and Kant's exegesis begins. And there's these other strands in Sellars' thought that strike me as kind of Humean. And I think that these are two different pictures of where that normative pressure might come from. So I want to just hear your thoughts on this. And the things I'm thinking about are at the end of Science and Ethics, when he talks about the support for the moral point of view is about love and concern for others' well-being. It's this precious thing that's laid down in childhood. That doesn't sound very Kantian to me. But sounds like it could provide the normative pressure that you're looking for, or that we're looking for. What do you make of those two strands?
Yeah, maybe I start out commenting on these last passages of Science and Ethics, and he has it elsewhere. I seem somehow to like that. I think what he's trying to say in these passages is that we are imperfect beings, and just working with these instruments of rational reasoning probably won't get us very far as humans, right? With all these imperfections and mental shortcuts that we must this is that we exhibit and must exhibit, right? And he thinks that we need the psychology to support our moral behavior, but that in the end, when it comes to justifying how I behaved, then I can revert to something like the moral point of view and say, okay, look, it just follows from our being a moral community and for our intending the welfare of each of us that we behave nicely to each other, right? But when I am in an actual situation where the question is, how should I behave, then maybe we don't need to presuppose, and this would be impractical, right, that we always have to reflect on that. Some things can just be supported by these psychological mechanisms and processes, like love, right? Whether this amounts then to a defending or accounting for the normative pressure that there is for adopting a moral perspective or a group perspective, I'm not really sure, because it's contingent, right? We could have been different beings. And we could have evolved different psychological attitudes and dispositions, and what would that mean for the moral point of view? Would it have been a different moral point of view, or would it just not have been available to beings like us, but still be the same moral point of view? So I'm not really sure that these passages answer to that question, whether we should take up the moral point of view, whether there is normative pressure to do that. I think at some point, but I'm not really sure what to make of Sellars. There, for example, on reasoning about values, he says at a point that this question, why should I be moral, so why should I take up the moral point of view, is there a good reason to do that, that this is just still an open question, so he seems to be reluctant to say that there's something like a normative reason for taking up the moral point of view. And he's reluctant to say, okay, that I have anything like a convincing reason that I can rationally show to someone who does not take up the moral point of view that that person should do so. So I'm not really sure how what his position actually is, but he seems to be reluctant to say that there is normative pressure, but maybe we need it, right?
Stefanie, what a nice paper, thank you. I was wondering, when philosophers of language think about ought statements, they tend to say that an ought claim is true. What the semantics they give you is there's a set of possible worlds or a set of options, and X ought to be the case. You rank the options, and then the ought claim is the top one. And I was wondering if you couldn't say something like this. Look, there's the situation where we reason as if all of our team partners are thinking like a team. And then there's the situation where we are more realistic and we say, okay, these other team partners aren't going to think like a team. And that gives you different sets of options, right? So if we're all thinking like a team, if you and I are in this prisoner's dilemma situation, and we're both thinking like a team, then we got 4 options to choose from, and optimizing on those, we ought to both cooperate. But if I am, a free rider, then you don't have 4 options anymore. The team only has 2 options because I've foreclosed 2 of them, the 2 where I cooperate. I'm going to defect. So the team only has 2 options, and so optimizing on those 2 options, maybe we get a different set of, ought claims. So I think, wouldn't that give us, everything that you want, that each of us ought to cooperate, and I ought to cooperate, and you ought to, and you know, this other person ought to cooperate. Because when we make those statements, we're thinking about the case where everybody's operating as a team. And then when we're more realistic, there might actually be a different set of what I ought to do. That might depend. But anyway, does that seem like an option? Does that seem like a solution to you, and does it fit with one of the two options you suggested?
Yeah, I think this is, like Matthew Chrisman has a view like that on odd, and then the idea that depending on whether it is warranted to assume that everybody will identify with the team, or we assume that there will be free riders, we will have a different ranking of possible words, and then we just different possible words at the top, right? I think, I don't see why this would be incompatible with what I say. I think Preston has a similar, like, ecumenic view of that. You can combine different approaches, but what I think, what might be the advantage of, what I proposed is that it gives you a more direct route of how human agents who already coordinate and cooperate could have developed these capacities to speak in terms of odd, because you just presuppose that that they introduce a second order level of discourse about first order discourse, which we know that anyway at some point they did, right? Because they started to talk about implication relations. Also in other contexts. And this is the question is whether on your story, whether we could account for this tight connection between talk about cooperation and coordination on the one hand and talk or use of concepts like the moral odd. So what I think is an advantage of this approach is that it gives you a tight package of these two notions. And the question is, how would you do that, for example, on the approach that you were suggesting?
Good. I'll have to think about it more. But thank you.
Well, I'm afraid that's the time we have. Thank you so much, Stefanie.